It's May 6th, 2026, and right now as you're watching this, more than 100 U.S. military aircraft are orbiting the skies above and around the Middle East, and specifically the Strait of Hormuz. The USS carrier strike groups are on station, and U.S. destroyers are holding the line at the entrance to the Persian Gulf. 24 hours ago, American warships and combat aircraft put 6 Iranian fast boats at the bottom of the Persian Gulf. And yet, the ceasefire technically holds for now, even though just a few days ago, Iran went ahead and launched a barrage of missiles at UAE. But here's what the IRGC, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the hardline paramilitary force that answers directly to the Supreme Leader inner circle, whoever that may be at this point. Here's what they had to say. The most consequential 48 hours in this entire conflict just concluded with something that nobody in the mainstream media is framing correctly. Iran's mullahs, the same leadership that told the world just days ago that they have not even begun yet, are right now sitting in Tehran reviewing a one-page memorandum drafted by the United States, passed through Pakistani mediators, that demands they hand over their entire stockpile of highly enriched uranium, accept a 15-year moratorium on enrichment, and open the Strait of Hormuz unconditionally. And the reason they are reviewing it instead of rejecting it outright, the reason the IRGC's bravado about not having begun yet has quietly disappeared from the headlines, is sitting at the bottom of the Persian Gulf. 6 Iranian fast attack boats, gone. Eliminated by U.S. Army Apache. Helicopters and Navy Seahawk crews in a matter of minutes during Operation Project Freedom. And that, combined with 67 days of the most comprehensive military degradation of a regional power since the Gulf War, is what brought us to this moment. So let's break down exactly what happened, what it means, and why the next 48 hours may close this chapter of history permanently. Parliament Speaker Mohammed Bagar Ghalab stood up in Tehran and declared, "We have not even begun yet." That's the rhetoric. So let's talk about what's actually happening on the water, even though they're saying they haven't begun yet. In the past 24 hours, President Trump directed the U.S. Navy to pause Project Freedom, the armed escort mission designed to shepherd stranded commercial vessels through the strait and out of the Persian Gulf. And here's the 2 Truth Social posts you need to know about. He said, based on the request of Pakistan and other countries, the tremendous military success we have had during the campaign against the country of Iran, and additionally the fact that great progress has been made toward a complete and final agreement with representatives of Iran. We have mutually agreed that while the blockade will remain in full force and affect Project Freedom, the movement of ships through the strait will be paused for a short period of time to see whether or not the agreement can be finalized and signed. And then just an hour ago, from the time of this video being produced, President Trump said this: assuming Iran agrees to give what has been agreed to, which is perhaps a big assumption, the already legendary Epic Fury will be at an end, and the highly effective blockade will allow the Hormuz Strait to open to all, including Iran. If they don't agree, the bombing starts, and it will be sadly at a much higher level and intensity than it was before. Thank you for your attention to this matter. President Donald J. Trump. So having the almost 200 Air Force fighters and bombers at Middle East bases in the region, they could light this back off if that gladiator thumbs down is given if Iran doesn't agree to the deal. But it looks like great progress, at least giving the enemy an off-ramp, which is a key part of the art of war. Let them save face so they feel like they're walking away from a position of strength. So this might create a comprehensive deal. And it's also said that Pakistan obviously wants this deal to happen as well. Mainstream media coverage is glossing over a lot of things, though. U.S. naval blockade of Iranian ports is still in full effect, while the media right now is trying to say, oh, the U.S. has completely pulled out. The U.S. is not projecting strength. Well, quite the opposite is true, my friend. With Iranian ports still having their ships pushed back in, and I'm saying ships for the record, the economic squeeze on Tehran has not paused for a second, not even 1 second. And the airborne umbrella protecting global shipping, this is happening right now, backed up by the 82nd Airborne. 82nd Airborne is using AI. They're using intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance to create what Secretary of War Pete Hegseth called a red, white, and blue dome over top of the Middle East and over top of Iran itself. That's up. That's active. Led by the 82nd Airborne, and Iran says, well, we haven't even begun yet. Well, I would say 6 of your fast attack boats did begin, and now they're at the bottom of the Persian Gulf. So I think you're racking up a tab without even having begun, which is odd. But what actually triggered this pause? What did U.S. forces do 24 hours before Trump made this call? The full operational breakdown starts right now. Operation Epic Fury, the major combat phase that the U.S. and Israel launched back on February 28th, had already achieved its core objectives, including degrading Iran's air defenses, targeting IRGC command and control, Infrastructure plus leadership, destroying their navy, and destroying their ability to produce ballistic missiles and drones, destroying their military capacity to build those things, also take down their ability to build a nuclear weapon. That's pretty much the primary objective. But on May 4th, the US launched Project Freedom. That was that new armed escort operation to physically guide stranded commercial ships through a southern lane running close to Omani territorial waters outside Iranian control. But within hours, Iran responded, of course, with their Mosquito fleet. CENTCOM US Central Command, the combatant command responsible to the Middle East, confirmed that Iran launched what Admiral Brad Cooper described as multiple cruise missiles, drones, and small boats, targeting both U.S. Navy ships and commercial vessels. U.S. forces responded decisively. CENTCOM confirmed that 6 Iranian small boats were eliminated by Apaches and Seahawk helicopters. President Trump cited that there were 7, so there were 6 or 7 of these boats that were taken down. Iranian state media denied their boats were sunk. Of course, they said they were tourist boats. Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of tourism going on in the Strait of Hormuz right now. Maybe the boats were just out there looking for the kamikaze dolphins, which the IRGC also claims they have. I mean, that's better than sharks with freaking laser beams at this point. And then, simultaneously, Iran launched drone and missile strikes on UAE oil refineries for 2 days in a row. The United Arab Emirates, one of the key Gulf partners for the US, confirmed the attack. And then the British military separately reported 2 cargo vessels were ablaze off the coast of UAE, and a third was hit by an unknown projectile in the strait itself. A South Korean-operated bulk carrier caught fire after an explosion. Seoul confirmed the vessel will be towed for repairs, with all 24 crew members accounted for. The full kinetic picture here, though, that's what the 24 hours was leading up to Trump's pause that just happened this morning. That's what it actually looked like on the water. And so it's also why when you hear Iran say, "We have not even begun," the correct response is, your boats are on the seafloor of the Persian Gulf. So maybe let's start there and let's acknowledge that you did actually begin. Now your boats are going to be beautiful reefs at the bottom of the Persian Gulf. So Iran's public posture stays defiant. Their private proposal stays desperate. Because the gap between what they say and what they're actually doing is where we'll find the truth. Tehran's supposed 14-point peace proposal that was delivered through Pakistan on April 30th reads like it was written by someone who thinks they won the war completely. And they don't have to negotiate at all because, remember, the IRGC and the leadership are so insulated from everything. They've taken all the treasure from their entire country and propped themselves up with golden palaces and golden crappers. Part of that peace proposal demands a full U.S. military withdrawal from the region, the lifting of the American naval blockade, unfreezing all of Iranians' overseas assets, war reparations paid to Iran, an end to all military operations, including in Lebanon, and creation of a brand new international control mechanism for the Strait of Hormuz. It's not a peace offer. It's basically a ransom note from the guy who's already in prison. The U.S. is completely aware that Iran is trying to tap along the world again with that supposed peace proposal. But here's a shock value number for you. Supposedly, there's 400 plus kilog of highly enriched uranium that Iran has accumulated, the kind refined to levels approaching weapons grade. That's according to the UN's own nuclear watchdog, the IAEA. That is enough fiscal material to potentially produce multiple nuclear devices if it's refined further. Washington saying this is a non-negotiable, that stockpile has to go, all of it. Iran's response, nuclear enrichment, is a sovereign right. And that gap right there is the center of gravity of the entire conflict that we're watching unfold. And here's the next shock value number, 230 plus. That is the number of loaded oil tankers that were confirmed anchored and waiting inside the Persian Gulf at the peak of the standoff. Unable to move, cargo stuck, their owners hemorrhaging costs. Iran's leverage is real, but is leverage that is also strangling China, strangling the Gulf states, strangling their European partners. We know that the UK and France obviously have ties with Iran. They're strangling global trade partners who are now quietly, very quietly, likely pushing Tehran toward a deal. Iran Foreign Minister Iraqi currently is in Beijing, lobbying for Chinese support, posted on X that Project Freedom is Project Deadlock. That would be more compelling if Rubio hadn't responded by urging China directly to tell Iraqi that continued attacks in the Strait make everyone's economic situation worse, including China's, because Beijing imports a significant share of their oil through Hormuz. They're not neutral bystanders here in this situation. So you've seen the threats from Iran. Now, let's meet the American hardware that is physically holding the line in Iran with the blockade still in full force. That's American Iron, and it's focused on the Arleigh-Burke-class destroyer, guided missile destroyers that are the Navy's workhorse. When it comes to this actual blockade itself, Arleigh Burke class is 509 FT of layered lethality. Its primary weapon system is the Mk-41 vertical launch system, the VLS, carrying up to 96 missiles in a standard configuration. That load can include Standard Missile SM-6 for long-range air-surface engagements, Evolved Sea Sparrow missiles for close and air defense work, and Tomahawk cruise missiles for land strikes. One ship, 96 deadly rounds, all loaded onto that one ship itself. Then, for the close-in fight against the Iranian fast boats and low-flying drones, the exact threat profile seen in the Strait of Hormuz over the last 48 hours, those ships actually carry a 5-in gun as well, called the Mk-45, that's capable of putting precisely aimed naval gunfire on surface targets at ranges that can go out to 10 Mi+, which is just wild. And then you add in the air assault force that's right there. That includes the A-10. The A-10 is likely the main one, leading the charge that would take on those Iranian fast boats should they come again and try to strike any commercial shipping or Navy vessels. The key highlight of that is the 30mm cannon on that thing. Also, the ability of the A-10 to carry rocket pods. Rocket pods, guided by lasers, highly effective going up against those fast attack boats. That to me is the #1 fast attack boat drone killing platform. Even though the Air Force always tries to get rid of it, it seems to always come back in and everybody says, oh wait, we need the A-10. We need to put at the forefront of this conflict, especially in the Strait of Hormuz. So, join me in saving the A-10. Comment below. Let's save the A-10, again, the #1 platform to take down drones and take down fast attack boats in this case. Also, the AH-64 Apache. Basically a fighter jet with a big rotor on top, but you basically have taken a fighter jet and turned it into a helicopter. It's the perfect combination. It's the love child of fighter jets and helicopters at this point. Rocket systems on that. A massive cannon in the front that actually tracks the gunner's head so the gunner can look, see symbology over what they want to shoot. Squeeze the trigger and unleash rounds onto targets, fast attack craft, and especially drones. That's a great drone killing platform. And you team that up with the A-10, and then you basically got a new scene in Step Brothers. But at this point, instead of them both, they're capable of simultaneously tracking hundreds of contacts and queuing weapons automatically, tying into Link 16, passing information about where the drones could be, where the different fast attack boats could be to A-10s, to AH-64s, to F-15, and to F-18s that will be up above as part of the drone killing force. You can't hide those fast attack boats from the sensor suite. The sensor suite is insane, and you can't outmaneuver it. You basically can't hide from it at all. It's definitely the stage 5 clingers of naval radars. Jeremy, you're amazing. Oh God, I think you're amazing. Oh my God, don't ever leave me. Ever. Good. So you've got close to 200 aircraft overhead in the Persian Gulf area, ready to go should things kick back off again. ISR is a big part of this intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance. Because Iran's IRGC Navy, they rely on speed and they rely on deceptive tactics where they try to hide these fast attack boats and then roll in with a disorienting swarm to try to overwhelm a single target against a carrier strike group with embarked aviation. So think about the F-18. You've got the E and the F. The F is the two-seater. That one is a strike platform, with the E platform being more of the air superiority platform. So now you've got this massive package to take on these IRGC fast attack boats. So the hardware from America is dominating the water, but the real game right now is playing out in Beijing, Islamabad, and in the Oval Office of the United States. The next 72 hours may force a choice that reshapes the Middle East for generations. So from a 40 chest strategic analysis section, Iran's military has been totally dominated. Their navy, their air force, their fleet, I mean, they could only launch 6 fast attack craft. Now that's not nothing, but it does show that their ability to do anything militarily has been severely degraded. And now they're going to rely on that proxy force to go in and try to wreak chaos. But here's the deal. If this thing kicks back off, everything is on the table. And it will start with the suppression of enemy air defenses where F-22s and F-35s roll in and will completely obliterate whatever Iran has been able to get back out into the front lines for their surface-to-air missile systems. But likely, Iran has updated some of those. President Donald Trump posted on Truth Social on Tuesday that Project Freedom, the operation to open the Strait of Hormuz, was temporarily paused as great progress has been made toward a complete and final agreement with representatives of Iran. Trump wrote, "Based on the request of Pakistan and other countries, the tremendous military success that we have had during the campaign against the country of Iran, and additionally, the fact that great progress has been made toward a complete and final agreement with representatives of Iran, we have mutually agreed that while the blockade will remain in full force and effect, Project Freedom will be paused for a short period of time to see whether or not the agreement can be finalized and signed. Read that statement one more time carefully. The blockade remains in full force and effect. This is not a pause in American pressure. This is not a retreat. This is the United States saying to Iran, we have already destroyed your navy. We have already eliminated your fast attack. Boats on day one of Project Freedom, we have already degraded your air defenses and ballistic missile production and nuclear enrichment infrastructure. And we are giving you a narrow window to accept terms before we resume at a significantly higher level of intensity. That is not negotiating from weakness. That is negotiating from the most dominant military position the U.S. has occupied in the Middle East since 2003. Trump followed up with a second Truth Social post on Wednesday stating, assuming Iran agrees to give what has been agreed to, which is perhaps a big assumption, the already legendary epic fury will be at an end, and the highly effective blockade will allow the Hormuz Strait to be open to all, including Iran. If they don't agree, the bombing starts, and it will be sadly at a much higher level and intensity than it was before. A much higher level and intensity than before. Let that land. Operation Epic Fury, launched February 28th, destroyed Iran's entire conventional navy, eliminated IRGC command and control infrastructure, targeted leadership, degraded ballistic missile and drone production facilities, and struck nuclear enrichment sites with precision munitions. And Trump is saying publicly, on record, that if this deal collapses, what comes next makes that look restrained. That is not rhetoric. That is a commander-in-chief describing a military option that 200-plus aircraft currently orbiting the Middle East are positioned to execute within hours of a thumbs-down decision. The United States and Iran are moving closer to an agreement on a short memorandum to end the Iran war, a regional source familiar with the negotiations told CNN. Key points include both countries lifting their respective blockades on the Strait of Hormuz, according to Axios. The lifting of the blockades would come in exchange for a U.S. removal of sanctions and an Iranian commitment to a 15-year moratorium on uranium enrichment. Iran would additionally agree to transfer its stockpile of highly enriched uranium outside of its borders, potentially to the U.S., a 15-year moratorium on enrichment, transfer of the entire highly enriched uranium stockpile out of Iran, potentially to American custody, and the opening of the Strait of Hormuz to all shipping without Iranian tolling, harassment, or control. 3 months ago, the Iranian regime would have called those terms a declaration of war. Today, they are reviewing them through Pakistani mediators. That gap between then and now is the distance that 67 days of Operation Epic Fury traveled, one strike package at a time. Washington wants Tehran to give up its stockpile of more than 400 kilograms of highly enriched uranium, which the United States says could be used to make a bomb. Iranian media reported that Tehran's 14-point proposal includes withdrawing U.S. forces from nearby areas, lifting the blockade, releasing frozen assets, paying compensation, lifting sanctions, ending the war on all fronts, including Lebanon, and creating a new control mechanism for the Strait. Iran's 14-point proposal. I went through this carefully, and I want to be honest with you about what it actually is. It demands a full U.S. military withdrawal from the region, the lifting of the American naval blockade, the unfreezing of all Iranian overseas assets, war reparations paid to Iran, and a new Iranian-administered control mechanism for the Strait of Hormuz. In other words, Iran wants to be paid for losing the war and then handed back control of the choke point it lost the war over. That is not a peace offer. That is the negotiating position of a regime that is so internally insulated from reality by the IRGC's information control that it genuinely does not understand the position it is in. And Washington's response to it was to produce a one-page memorandum that cuts through 14 points of fantasy and establishes the actual American red lines in terms that leave no room for creative interpretation. Across 67 days of Operation Epic Fury is the only way to understand why Iran is reviewing a one-page memorandum instead of laughing at it. And then we need to talk about the strategic picture of what happens in the next 48 hours, because the gap between a deal and a resumption of bombing at higher intensity than before has never been narrower than it is right now on May 6, 2026, and the details of that gap matter enormously. Start with the naval backbone of the blockade, because while the media has been focused on the fast attack boats and the Apache engagements, the Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers are the platforms that have been physically enforcing the economic stranglehold on Iran that brought the regime to this point. War Secretary Pete Hegseth said on Tuesday that the U.S. blockade on Iranian ports is holding, while the attacks by Iran since the ceasefire was announced are below the threshold of the U.S. restarting major combat operations. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said that Operation Epic Fury is over, but refused to let up on sanctions, warning Iran is still facing generational destruction to their economy. generational destruction to their economy. That phrase from Rubio is not hyperbole. The U.S. naval blockade has been turning commercial ships back from Iranian ports since April 13th. CENTCOM confirmed it has redirected at least 49 commercial vessels away from Iranian port access. Iran's oil revenue, the financial engine of the entire IRGC military machine, has been cut to a fraction of its pre-war levels. And every day the blockade continues. The economic pressure compounds in ways that the regime's golden palaces cannot insulate ordinary Iranians from forever. Secretary of State Marco Rubio announced that the U.S. would put a new draft resolution before the United Nations Security Council to defend freedom of navigation in the waterway. The draft resolution requires Iran to cease attacks, mining, and tolling. It demands that Iran disclose the number and location of the sea mines it has laid and cooperate with efforts to remove them, while also supporting the establishment of a humanitarian corridor. Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, and Qatar co-authored the draft resolution. 5 Gulf states co-authoring a UN Security Council resolution against Iran alongside the United States. That diplomatic architecture, built on top of the military dominance that Operation Epic Fury established, is exactly the kind of multilateral pressure framework that Iran's leadership understands and represents genuine, sustained international isolation. This is not America alone applying pressure. This is the entire Gulf region, the EU, the UK, Canada, Germany, France, all of them aligned against the IRGC's continued behavior, and all of them pushing through diplomatic channels for the deal that Pakistan is currently trying to close. Now let's talk about what is actually keeping Iran at the table, because the IRGC's parliament speaker said they have not even begun yet. And I want to address that directly, because that statement was made while 6 of their fast attack boats were being turned into artificial reefs by Apache helicopters. The Mosquito fleet that Iran spent decades building as its primary asymmetric naval deterrent, its go-to harassment doctrine against larger warships, in the confined geometry of the southern strait, sent 6 boats against Operation Project Freedom on May 4th. 6. The standard doctrine calls for swarms of 20 to 40 simultaneous attackers to overwhelm point defenses. Iran managed 6, and CENTCOM's AH-64, Apache, and MH-60 Seahawk crews eliminated every single one of them in minutes, while simultaneously intercepting every cruise missile and drone directed at the USS Truxtun and USS Mason. Not one scratch on either U.S. destroyer. Iran fired everything it had at the opening of Project Freedom, and the result was a 100% U.S. intercept rate across every threat category and 6 fewer fast attack boats in a fleet that was already a shadow of what it was on February 28th. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi called for a comprehensive ceasefire during his meeting with Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi in Beijing on Wednesday, May 6th, saying his country is deeply distressed by the war. Wang Yi stated that the international community shares a common concern for restoring normal and safe passage through the strait, and that China hopes the relevant parties will respond as quickly as possible to the strong calls from the international community. China, Iran's most important economic partner, its primary oil buyer, the country that has been publicly positioning itself as Tehran's diplomatic shield throughout this entire conflict, is now sitting across a table from Iran's foreign minister in Beijing and telling him that China needs the strait open and needs Iran to respond quickly to international calls for resolution. That is not a supportive ally giving Iran cover to hold out. That is a commercial dependency sending its most important customer a message that the status quo is economically unsustainable for Beijing as well as for everyone else. And Secretary Rubio understood exactly what that meeting in Beijing meant, which is why he went straight to the cameras and urged China to tell Araghchi directly that continued hostility in the waterway will cause Tehran to be globally isolated. A Pakistani source involved in the peace efforts told Reuters on Wednesday, "We will close this very soon. We are getting close." Pakistan's foreign minister added that the country is working to ensure the agreement would lead to a permanent end to the conflict. According to Axios, the U.S. expects a response from Iran within 48 hours regarding the key points of a one-page, 14-point memorandum of understanding. An Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesperson told CNBC later on Wednesday that the proposal was being evaluated. Being evaluated, not rejected, not dismissed as imperialist aggression, not met with the kind of defiant press conference that the IRGC's information bubble would normally produce. Evaluated. That single word from the Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman on May 6th is the most significant diplomatic signal to emerge from Tehran since the ceasefire on April 8th, because it means the Iranian civilian leadership, the part of the regime that is not the IRGC Military Council, understands that the window for a deal that leaves Iran with something is closing. And once it closes, what comes next is the bombing at a much higher level and intensity that Trump put on the talk to me with such great respect, and then they go on television and say, we did not speak to the president. So they play games. But let me just tell you, they want to make a deal. They want to make a deal. And the reason they want to make a deal is sitting in plain sight across 67 days of documented military, naval, economic, and diplomatic pressure that has left Iran's conventional military annihilated, its fast attack fleet decimated, its oil revenue blockaded, its uranium program targeted, its IRGC leadership degraded, and its most important commercial ally sitting across a table in Beijing telling it to respond quickly to international calls. That is what bringing a regime to its knees actually looks like. Not a surrender ceremony, not a white flag. A one-page memorandum handed through Pakistani mediators being evaluated in Tehran while 200-plus American aircraft orbit the skies above the Middle East, waiting for a thumbs up or a thumbs down. The next 48 hours will tell us which direction this goes, and hardware files will be here for every development the moment it breaks. If this analysis gave you the full picture that the mainstream is consistently missing, hit that like button right now because it directly helps this channel reach the people who need to hear this depth of coverage. Subscribe to Hardware Files and enable notifications because this situation is moving by the hour and we are here every single day. Drop your take in the comments below. Do you think Iran signs the memorandum in the next 48 hours, or does the bombing resume at higher intensity? Every comment gets read. This is history in real time, and we are covering every chapter of it together. Iran will adapt and adjust. Likely, a lot of manpads will be in the area, up on hillsides, trying to shoot down any fighters that may make their way in to strike specific targets. But again, the uranium stockpile is going to be the number one thing to watch if this conflict kicks back off. Will that be something that's struck and completely buried underground, or will specific surgical teams go in to try to recover that? What do you think? What do you think happens in this conflict moving forward? Let me know what you think in the comments below. Do you think conflict will kick back off in the next 72 hours? Would love to hear your thoughts. Iran believed it controlled one of the most powerful choke points on Earth. For decades, it sat at the edge of the Strait of Hormuz and built an entire national strategy around a single idea. Control the passage, control the world's energy, and you control the decisions of nations. If the strait closes, oil stops. If oil stops, industries slow down. If industries slow down, economies weaken. If economies weaken, governments panic. And when governments panic, they negotiate. That was the logic. That was the leverage. That was the weapon Iran believed it had perfected over 40 years. And for a long time, it worked perfectly. Not because Iran used it, but because it didn't have to. The threat alone was enough. The idea of closing the Strait of Hormuz was more powerful than actually doing it. No country wanted to test that reality. No global power wanted to risk triggering a disruption that could shake the entire world economy, because nearly 20% of global oil supply moves through that narrow corridor. That is not just a statistic. That is the backbone of global energy flow. So the system stayed stable, the balance held, the threat remained theoretical until 2026. Because in 2026, everything changed. The theory was no longer enough. The situation escalated, and for the first time, the possibility of closure became real. And when that moment came, something unexpected happened. The world did not freeze, it adapted. And that single shift changed everything. When tensions escalated and the Strait of Hormuz was effectively disrupted, the immediate impact was massive. Shipping traffic slowed down dramatically. Oil tankers hesitated to enter the region. Insurance premiums skyrocketed. Many routes became too risky to operate. Oil prices surged rapidly. Markets reacted instantly. Fear spread across global financial systems. Governments rushed into emergency meetings. Energy security became the top priority overnight. And one question dominated global discussions. Can the world function without the Strait of Hormuz? At first, the answer seemed obvious. No, because infrastructure takes years to build. Because global supply chains are deeply connected. Because geography cannot be changed overnight. But that assumption did not last long. Because the system did not collapse. It adjusted. It moved. It started searching for alternatives. And one country moved faster than anyone expected. The United Arab Emirates. Instead of reacting with military escalation, the UAE took a completely different approach. It responded with infrastructure. It activated a pipeline, not a new pipeline, not something built in response to the crisis, but something that had been quietly developed years earlier. A pipeline designed specifically for this kind of scenario. This pipeline connects Abu Dhabi's inland oil fields directly to the port of Fujairah, and Fujairah is located on the Gulf of Oman, outside the Strait of Hormuz, outside the choke point. That location is critical because it allows oil to bypass the strait completely. And the moment the crisis escalated, the UAE pushed the system to its limits. Oil that would normally flow through Hormuz was redirected. Instead of moving through the Persian Gulf, it moved eastward, straight to open waters, straight to international markets. The pipeline carries around 1.5 to 1.8 million barrels per day. That is not enough to replace Hormuz entirely, but it is enough to change the equation. Because for the first time, a major energy exporter proved something important. Hormuz is not the only route, and once that idea becomes reality, everything changes. Because power in geopolitics is not just about control, it is about perception. And the perception of absolute control had just been broken, but the UAE was not alone in this shift. Saudi Arabia moved as well. Its east-west pipeline became a critical part of the global response. This pipeline stretches across the country from the Persian Gulf to the Red Sea, and during the crisis, its capacity usage increased dramatically. Millions of barrels per day were redirected. Oil that would have passed through Hormuz was sent across land instead. Together, these pipelines created something new, not a replacement system, but a backup system, a parallel route, enough to reduce panic, enough to stabilize supply, enough to show that the system can adapt under pressure, and adaptation is the most dangerous thing for any choke point strategy. Because choke points depend on dependency. They depend on the idea that there is no alternative. The moment an alternative appears, even a partial one, the entire strategy starts to weaken. And that is exactly what happened. Iran's leverage was not destroyed overnight, but it was challenged. And once leverage is challenged, it begins to erode. But this is where the situation becomes more complex, because pipelines are not perfect solutions. They have limits. They have capacity constraints. They cannot carry the same volume as global shipping routes. And more importantly, they are fixed targets. Unlike ships that move across oceans, pipelines stay in one place. They can be located, they can be tracked, they can be targeted. That makes them vulnerable. And that vulnerability quickly became part of the equation. Energy infrastructure came under pressure. Facilities faced disruptions. Operations slowed down in key areas. And critics raised an important argument. Replacing one vulnerable system with another does not eliminate risk. It simply changes its form. And that argument is valid. Because even with pipelines operating at full capacity, the global system remained under stress. Supply stayed tight. Prices remained volatile. Uncertainty continued to dominate market behavior. So the Strait of Hormuz did not become irrelevant overnight. It still mattered. It still carried weight. But something deeper had changed, the perception of dependence. Before this crisis, Hormuz was seen as irreplaceable, as a single point of failure that could not be bypassed. Now it was seen differently. Now it was one route among several. Still important, but no longer absolute. And that shift in perception changes behavior. Because geopolitics is not just about physical control, it is about psychological leverage. If countries believe they have no choice, they act cautiously. They avoid confrontation. They maintain balance. But if they believe alternatives exist, even imperfect ones, everything changes. They take stronger positions. They form new alliances. They invest in new infrastructure. And that is exactly what started happening. Energy importers began diversifying their supply routes. New agreements were signed. Emergency investments were approved. Projects that had been delayed for years suddenly became urgent because the world had learned something important. Dependence is a risk, and reducing that risk became the new priority. Countries that once stayed neutral started shifting their stance. Regional dynamics began to change, and the system started evolving in real time. And that evolution is the real story here. Because even if the Strait of Hormuz fully reopens, the system will not go back to what it was before. The assumption that one narrow waterway can control global energy has been broken. And once that assumption is broken, it cannot be easily restored. The long-term impact of this shift could reshape the entire region. More pipelines will be built. More alternative routes will be developed. More redundancy will be added to the system. And that means less reliance on any single choke point. And less reliance means less leverage. Iran's strategy was built on geography, on positioning, on the belief that location alone could guarantee power. But geography can be bypassed. Infrastructure can expand. Technology can evolve. And when enough pressure is applied, the world adapts faster than expected. That is exactly what happened. The attempt to demonstrate control triggered a response that accelerated independence. The move that was supposed to strengthen leverage may have actually weakened it, and that is where the real strategic shift begins, because once the world starts building around you, your position changes. Slowly at first, then all at once. And Iran is now facing that reality. A reality where its most powerful advantage is no longer unquestioned. A reality where the world is no longer waiting. It is moving. It is building. It is adapting. And once adaptation begins, it does not stop. It accelerates. But what makes this shift even more significant is what it reveals about the limits of power built on geography. Because for decades, Iran's entire strategy depended on one assumption, that the world had no choice. That assumption is now under pressure. And once an assumption like that starts to crack, it does not stop at the surface. It spreads deeper into every layer of the system. Because this is not just about oil flows. This is about decision-making at the highest levels of global power. When the Strait of Hormuz was disrupted, countries were forced to confront a reality they had avoided for decades. What happens if the choke point fails? And more importantly, what happens if it can be bypassed? That question is now shaping long-term strategy. Energy importing nations are no longer thinking in terms of stability. They are thinking in terms of resilience, because stability can be broken. But resilience can absorb shocks, and that shift in thinking is already visible. Countries like China and India, which depend heavily on Gulf energy supplies, are accelerating diversification plans. They are expanding storage capacity. They are securing alternative suppliers. They are investing in infrastructure that reduces reliance on any single route, because the lesson is clear. Dependence creates vulnerability, and vulnerability invites disruption. At the same time, global energy companies are adjusting their strategies. Shipping routes are being reassessed, risk calculations are being updated, insurance models are being rewritten, because the cost of disruption has now been experienced in real time, and once that cost is understood, behavior changes permanently. But there is another layer to this story, a layer that goes beyond economics, a layer that involves politics and alliances, because the response to the crisis was not just technical, it was political. Countries that once maintained careful neutrality are now being pulled into clearer positions. The UAE's decision to activate its bypass pipeline was not just an economic move, it was a strategic signal, a signal that it is willing to operate independently of Iran's influence. And that signal did not go unnoticed. Regional dynamics began to shift almost immediately. Alliances started strengthening. Security cooperation increased. Joint planning discussions intensified. Because the risk was no longer theoretical, it was real. And real risks demand real responses. Saudi Arabia's actions reinforced this shift. By increasing the use of its east-west pipeline, it demonstrated that large-scale redirection is possible. Not perfect, not complete, but possible. And possibility is enough to change strategic thinking. Because once something is proven possible, it becomes a foundation for future expansion. And that is exactly what is happening now. Discussions are already underway about expanding pipeline capacity. New routes are being evaluated. Long-term infrastructure projects are being accelerated, because the goal is no longer just efficiency. The goal is redundancy. Multiple routes, multiple options, multiple layers of security, and every new layer reduces dependence on the Strait of Hormuz. Every new project weakens its strategic importance. But this transition is not simple. It comes with costs. Building pipelines is expensive. Maintaining them is complex. Protecting them requires constant vigilance. And even then, they remain vulnerable, because fixed infrastructure cannot move. And in a region with ongoing tensions, that matters. Attacks on energy infrastructure highlight this risk clearly. Facilities can be targeted. Supply can be disrupted. Repairs can take time. And during that time, markets react. Prices move. Confidence drops. Uncertainty spreads. So while pipelines provide alternatives, they also introduce new challenges. And managing those challenges requires coordination. Coordination between governments. Coordination between companies. Coordination between allies. Because no single actor can manage this alone. And that is leading to another important shift, increased international cooperation. Countries that once operated independently are now working together more closely. Information sharing is increasing. Joint security measures are being discussed. Collective responses are being planned, because the threat is shared. And shared threats create shared interests. This is how geopolitical landscapes evolve, not through single events, but through reactions to those events. And the reaction to the Hormuz disruption is still unfolding, but its direction is already clear. Less dependence, more diversification, greater resilience. That shift is not temporary, it is structural. Because once systems start adapting, they do not return to their previous state. They evolve, they expand, they reinforce the changes that kept them alive. And that is exactly what is happening now. The Strait of Hormuz is still there. The ships will eventually return, the traffic will recover, but the illusion is gone. The belief that one narrow passage can control the entire global energy system has been broken. And in geopolitics, perception is power. When perception changes, power follows. Iran did not just test its strategy, it exposed its limits. Because a strategy built on control only works as long as that control remains unquestioned. The moment it is challenged, the system begins searching for a way out. And once that search begins, it does not stop. It accelerates. It spreads across industries, across countries, across alliances. Every new pipeline, every new agreement, every new route is part of that acceleration, is part of that shift away from dependence. And that is the real consequence of this moment. Not just disruption, but transformation. Because the world is no longer reacting. It is preparing. Preparing for a future where no single choke point can hold it hostage. Preparing for a system that is more flexible, more distributed, more resilient. And in that system, leverage changes, power shifts, and strategies that once seemed unbreakable start to fade. Iran built its advantage over decades, carefully, patiently, strategically. But in one moment, by trying to prove that advantage, it triggered the process that could eventually erase it. And that is the paradox of power. The more you try to prove it, the more you risk losing it. The Strait of Hormuz is not gone, but its dominance is no longer absolute. Its control is no longer guaranteed, and its role in global energy is no longer untouchable. The world has seen another way. And once the world sees another way, it never forgets it. This is not the end of the story. This is the beginning of a new phase, a phase where control is replaced by competition, where dependence is replaced by diversification, and where every crisis becomes a catalyst for change. Because in the end, the most powerful force in geopolitics is not control, it is adaptation.